So for this video, I'm going to be discussing my top 10 Stephen King villains of all time. And of course, this is a very subjective list. I'm not saying like these are objectively the best Stephen King villains out there, but these are my personal favorite. Really 10 through 9 can kind of go in any order, but I will say I'm going to be saving my number one favorite Stephen King villain at the end of the video at the number one spot. They've always been my favorite villain. And like I said, the rest of this list, these are like my top 10. And then I will also mention some honorable mentions at the end of the video. But really, like my number one spot, like they're my favorite villain. And I'll let you know why. But yeah, anyway, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's go ahead and start off with number 10. This might be a lot of people's favorite just because they show up in a lot of Stephen King books. That might give it away here, but I'm going to say number 10 is Randall Flagg. And of course, he's well known for being one of the antagonists in the Dark Tower series. But like I mentioned, he's in a lot of Stephen King books. He's in The Stand, he's in The Eyes of the Dragon. He even pops up in other random stuff, maybe even Gwendy's Button Box. He makes an appearance. But yeah, he shows up in a lot of different places in the Stephen King multiverse. Very good villain overall. I wouldn't say he's necessarily one of the scariest, but he is one of the more entertaining ones. Like I said, he's all across Stephen King's multiverse, so it's a lot of fun when he does appear. I would say probably most notably in The Stand and the Dark Tower series. But that's my number 10 spot is Randall Flagg. And for number 9, this might be a bit of an underrated Stephen King villain. And maybe a lot of people don't even think about this when it comes to Stephen King villains because he's kind of just like a real character, if that makes any sense. But number 9, I'm going to go with Percy Whitmore from The Green Mile. Now, talk about hateable characters. Now, in the grand scheme of things, like, is he a villain? Like, he's not a villain like Pennywise or a lot of these other guys, but like, he's just a really nasty dude. Like, the way that Stephen King writes him, you just hate him. Like, he does bad things, and like, it's hard to talk about without spoiling the book, but like, he's a prison guard at this prison at the Green Mile, and the things that he does just really gets under your skin. Stephen King has a really good knack for just writing people that just gets under your skin. Like, oh, I just want to jump into the book and just knock him in the head. That's Percy Whitmore in a sentence there. He's just, he's the worst. But yeah, he's on this list just because every time I either read the book or watch the movie, just like, ah. And number 8, arguably not a villain, but like this a thing is definitely an antagonist. And I'm going to have to say number 8 is Cujo. Now, to be fair, it's not exactly Cujo's fault. He basically gets bitten by a rabid bat and then gets rabies and then goes around killing a bunch of people. So it's not necessarily his fault. He's not like a demon, and he's not just a dog that just loves to bite people. Like, he was a friendly dog at the beginning. He was a good boy, but he eventually becomes rabid and starts terrorizing people. And yeah, it's a very conflicting feeling because like, this dog really needs to be put down, but at the same time, it's not his fault. So kind of a conflicting villain. So yeah, I really like Cujo. Kind of an underrated book, honestly. A lot of people say that they don't love the first half of it, but they love the part where obviously Cujo does the killing. But yeah, it's a great book, and Cujo, definitely one of my favorite villains. And for number 7 on the list, possibly another underrated villain. Maybe not one that often comes up in these discussions, but again, another person kind of like Percy Whitmore, who's more of a realistic character. Like, this person probably does exist. And that would be Warden Norton from The Shawshank Redemption. Now, this guy is the warden of The Shawshank Redemption. He's in charge of the prison, and he does some pretty awful things, especially when regards to the main character of the novella. I can't go into specifics because it's a novella and it'll spoil a lot of stuff, but he does some nasty stuff for Andy Dufresne. At first, it looks like, oh, maybe he can build a friendship with him, and then maybe he can have a positive experience in prison. But then you get further into the thing, you're just like, oh, this guy is just nasty and is willing to do anything, and just another guy that I just want to jump into the story and just punch him in the face. But yeah, Warden Norton, I don't often see him on top 10 lists of Stephen King villains like this, but like he deserves to be on there. And for number 6, we have another non-human character on the list, and that would be Christine, obviously from Christine. Definitely one of my all-time favorite Stephen King villains. If you've seen the movie, basically you know that Christine is just an evil car that can kind of put itself back together when it's wrecked and will go after people and kill people. Very fun movie. But I will say in the book, it definitely goes into a bit more detail about why the car is the way it is. It basically is possessed by the spirit of this guy, and he's, I don't want to spoil it too much, but like, it's really cool. The book is really compelling. One of my favorites. Again, slightly underrated. But yeah, Christine, evil car. Stephen King is really good at just taking goofy premises, but actually making them really work well. And Christine is just an excellent villain, antagonist. And now we're cracking into the top 5 here. And for number 5, I'm going to go ahead and go with Margaret White from Carrie. And if you're unaware, Margaret White is Carrie White's mom. And maybe people would argue that Carrie is the villain in here, especially what she does towards the end of the book, which I get it, but at the same time, one of the driving forces behind why Carrie is like this is Margaret's mom. She's one of those people that's just a religious zealot, a religious nut who just, really is just basically hiding Carrie away from real life and just doesn't want her to become, it's really frustrating because people like this actually exist, where they just are religious freaks, if you will, and they just can't, they just won't let anybody else have an opinion, really, and they just are really hiding Carrie away, or she is, I will say. And oftentimes when that happens, kids who grow up in very religious households, like not like just religious, but like very strict households, they will lash out in some way. And Carrie might have gone a bit overboard, but it's all really thanks to Carrie's mom just being an obnoxious religious zealot. And the things that she does to Carrie White in this book, and the thing that she says to Carrie White in this book, really get under my skin. And this was Stephen King's very first villain, the very first published novel, and I think he knocked it out of the park. One of the best debut novels of all time, and made her way into the top 5 Stephen King villains list. And number 4, definitely one of my favorite villains of all time. This one, like a lot of these villains do terrible, terrible things. This one, he does some bad stuff, but kind of in a fun way. And that would be Leland Gaunt from Needful Things. And if you don't know the premise of this book and you don't know who Leland Gaunt is, he's the owner of this brand new shop that opens up in Castle Rock called Needful Things. And basically for his store, he sells a bunch of stuff that people really want, but for payment, he doesn't take money. He asks people to do these little favors and these little pranks. And basically the premise of the book is that these little things that he does, or that he gets people to do for him, kind of escalate, and the whole town kind of collapses in on itself and just chaos ensues, and it's all thanks to Leland Gaunt. And technically, I don't remember if he actually does anything in the book, but he gets people to do crazy stuff for him. So he's definitely the inciting incident in why this town of Castle Rock goes into complete chaos, and it's just a lot of fun. It's one of the most fun Stephen King villains, and yeah, he's definitely up there as one of my favorites. Number 4, Leland Gaunt. And now we're cracking into the top 3. You can probably guess who these 3 villains are. Probably Stephen King's 3 most iconic villains, but it might interest you to see what order I put them in. For number 2, or I'm sorry, skipping ahead of myself here. Number 3, I'm going to go ahead and go with Jack Torrance from The Shining. So we all know The Shining, and just a quick shout out, we're going to be reading The Shining in November for the Stephen King Book Club. And actually, this video is probably going to be out way after that. But anyway, Jack Torrance from The Shining. We all know the story of Jack Torrance and his family basically taking this job at the Overlook Hotel. They're going to be looking after the hotel during the months where it's just going to be snowed in and they can't really accept guests. And they're going to be taking care of the hotel, and Jack's going to be writing his book. But eventually, the Overlook Hotel kind of gets a hold on him, and spoiler alert, he becomes the antagonist. And yeah, it's a wild ride, and Jack Torrance is infamous for quite a few reasons. I will say I love the book version, but I might also love the movie version even more. And of course, that's an unpopular opinion. People either love the movie or they hate it, and then I won't get into all that. But Jack Torrance, I love both the book and the movie version. So yeah, Jack Torrance, definitely a heavy hitter, and for me, he comes in at number 3 on the list. And now I've got 2 left, and basically once I say number 2, you're probably going to know who number 1 is, and it really shouldn't be that big of a surprise. Number 2, a non-human character. So probably a big giveaway right there. It's Pennywise, the dancing clown from It. While this is not one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, I obviously recognize that Pennywise himself is a tremendous antagonist, one of the best villains of all time. And basically, it's just got one of the coolest premises ever, where he literally will take your biggest fear and use it against yourself, and will literally shapeshift into your biggest fear. That's a really cruel and cool premise. And yeah, I first got introduced to Pennywise with the miniseries when I was really young, and really dug that, and then eventually read the book and really enjoyed Pennywise as the villain. And then obviously the movie came out, and that was a big thing. But yeah, like I said, it's not one of my favorite books Stephen King has ever written. I think it is a bit long, a bit overrated a little bit, and the ending I don't really love as much. But I gotta admit, Pennywise is definitely one of the best creations he's ever made, one of the best antagonists of all time. And yeah, he comes in at number 2 on the list. All right, we've made it to my number 1 spot. But before I talk about that, I'm going to mention some honorable mentions here. Some things that you might be like, oh, I thought that would be in the top 10. Probably one that you guys are like, where's this guy? Kurt Barlow from Salem's Lot. He's pretty good. I will be honest, though, I'm not a big vampire guy, so Kurt Barlow is definitely one of the best vampires of all time. But again, I'm not a huge vampire guy, so he's not quite on my top 10, but I gotta admit, Kurt Barlow is very good as a villain. Also, The Mist from Skeleton Crew, there's a lady in here called Mrs. Carmody, and she is really something. Go check out The Mist if you haven't already. Basically, if you don't know the story, people get locked into this grocery store because of the mist and creatures that are in the mist, and Mrs. Carmody is a character in the grocery store, and she's something. So check it out if you haven't already. And then another one that I'm going to throw out there is Rose the Hat from Dr. Sleep, which we will be reading in December for the Stephen King short story, or not the short story book club, the book club. We're going to be reading that in December. Pretty compelling villain. Not one of the best, I will say, not top 10 worthy, but very compelling. So Rose the Hat comes in as an honorable mention, as well as Mrs. Carmody and Kurt Barlow. But now getting back to the list and talking about my number 1 favorite Stephen King villain of all time. You probably already know who she is. Big giveaway there. It's Annie Wilkes from Misery. Definitely my all-time favorite Stephen King villain. Possibly even my favorite villain of all time. If you don't know the premise of Misery, where have you been? Go read the book. But basically, Annie Wilkes captures Paul Sheldon, or some would even say save Paul. Well, really, she does save Paul Sheldon. But basically, Paul Sheldon is her favorite writer. Annie Wilkes is his number 1 fan. He gets into a bad car wreck, and she kind of saves him from the snow and brings him in and nurses him back to life, essentially. But crazy things ensue because she is her number 1. She is his number 1 fan, and she's a bit a little loony, just a little bit. And crazy things happen in this book. You might be able to see from the cover there. Yeah, it goes into some wild places, and Annie Wilkes herself is just so compelling. I love rereading this book. And yeah, and also brilliantly played by Kathy Bates in the 1990 movie. Excellent. But yeah, Annie Wilkes is by far and away my favorite Stephen King villain of all time. All right, so that is my top 10 favorite Stephen King villains of all time. Annie Wilkes takes the #1 spot, but also in the top 3, we've got Pennywise and Jack Torrance. That's usually who I see in the top 3, and that's basically my opinion as well. Like, those are the most iconic Stephen King villains for a reason. But my other ones, if I can rattle them off here, we've got Leland Gaunt at the #4 spot. We got Margaret White at the #5 spot. And then I'm probably not going to remember the order, but we've got Randall Flagg. We've got Percy Whitmore. We've got Warden Norton. And we got Cujo and Christine. So those all kind of round out my top 10 favorite Stephen King villains of all time. And then, of course, some honorable mentions with Kurt Barlow. That would probably make a lot of people's top 10 list. Maybe you're mad that he's not in mine, but, you know, vampires, meh, take him or leave him. Also, Mrs. Carmody, underrated Stephen King villain. Wanted to kind of put her in the top 10, but really couldn't put her above any of the other people that are in my top 10 or things. And then also Rose the Hat, underrated, not one of the best Stephen King villains, but I also wanted to mention her because I really like her. So yeah, that's my top 10. Annie Wilkes takes the #1 spot. Let me know what y'all think of my list here, whether you agree with me or completely disagree with me. I want to know your thoughts and comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and continue to subscribe to the Book of Strummer. I've also got the Book of Strummer Discord, which I'll link down below. I've also got my Patreon down below. You can support me there for as little as $1 a month. And I've got my Amazon wishlist if you want to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.